3 years ago, the IPCC told us that if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll have to cut emissions by around 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. My name is Kaya Axelsson, and I'm part of a team at the University of Oxford that tracks progress towards that goal. I'm here today to bring you an update on how the global effort to reach net zero is going. At a country level, the response has been impressive. Since the IPCC's announcement, we've seen a 6-fold increase in national net zero commitment. More than 90% of the global economy is now covered by a national net zero target. Leading corporate actors have also responded. Last year, our team announced at this very event that 1 in 5 of the world's largest companies had a net zero target. That figure is now 1 in 3, with more companies committing to net zero every week. The momentum behind net zero commitment is so strong that companies without such targets will soon be in the minority, and laggards should expect to face difficult questions from customers, employees, regulators, and investors. Yet not all targets are created equal, and commitments are not the same as action. Our research team has mapped the criteria that the UN and other expert-informed organizations use to define high-quality net zero targets. And despite the proliferation of initiatives providing guidance to companies, we found strong convergence in the landscape between them. We also found significant gaps in what companies are committed to, and what we and others see as a meaningful net zero strategy. I'll walk you through the key components of a high-quality standard and share our latest data on how the private sector is performing. As I step through the criteria, I'll use a simple acronym, SCORE, to help you remember core net zero components. There may be a pop quiz later. The S in SCORE stands for short-term plans of action, also known as interim targets. Setting a net zero target for 2050 is not an excuse to delay taking action today. Yet, only around half of companies with net zero commitments have any type of interim emission reduction target, and this is critically insufficient. C stands for coverage of greenhouse gases. One of the most common greenwashing critiques is that net zero targets don't cover the full scope of emissions, and our research shows that this complaint is valid. 6 out of every 10 targets fails to fully cover Scope 3 emissions. That's not the only way that coverage falls short. CO2 is a top priority and has a long lifespan in the atmosphere, but we also need to deal with other greenhouse gases, particularly methane, which is highly potent. While the most recognized standard-setting initiatives emphasize the importance of addressing all greenhouse gases, several do not, which might help to explain why less than half of corporate net zero targets cover all greenhouse gases. Next up is O for offsetting, which some view as a moral hazard in itself. The fear here is that companies will use offsets to buy their way to net zero rather than reducing their own emissions. But the guidance is clear that such a strategy is not acceptable, and offsets can only be used to compensate for the hardest to abate emissions in a net zero strategy. However, nearly 40% of Forbes 2000 companies with net zero targets intend to use offsets, and most do not specify quality conditions under which those offsets would be used. More detail is needed in corporate net zero plans as to how, when, and towards what claims voluntary credits will be used. R is for regular public reporting, which is critical for transparency, but also soon to be mandatory across half of the global economy. About 2/3 of companies with net zero targets annually report their progress on emissions reduction through corporate sustainability reports and other channels. The final third will soon likely be required to do so. E is the last and most important consideration for net zero companies. It's about what companies are really all about at the end of the day, and that's people. To maintain credibility, net zero transition plans must consider equity for workers, for local communities, and for those most globally impacted by climate change. Your company will have to make bold moves in this great transition, and you'll need to take people with you. While this is not an easy metric to measure, our initial analysis suggested that no more than 10% of corporate committers explicitly considered equity in their net zero reports. If you're watching right now and you work for a company, take a moment to consider how your company scores across these key criteria. When we look back across these criteria and data points, my colleagues and I find that only 1/3 of corporations that target net zero currently meet the minimum robustness criteria. Less than 5% meet all the leadership practices set out by the UN-backed high-level climate champions. However, ambitious companies are responding fast, and new reports and strategies are published with greater detail each quarter. You might have already felt pressure from customers or investors to improve your net zero strategy. More is almost certainly coming, including from regulators. Our research indicates that these kinds of criteria may be on what we call a conveyor belt of policy development, beginning as voluntary initiatives and evolving into government mandate. Take disclosure rules as an example. Some form of climate disclosure is already mandatory in China, the UK, and in the next 2 years, new disclosure rules will come into force in the EU, India, and Canada. By 2025, climate disclosure will become mandatory in 8 jurisdictions, covering almost half of GDP and global emissions. In addition to disclosure frameworks, we expect to see more governments introducing common procurement and product standards, mandatory transition plans, and sectoral decarbonization benchmarks. It is clear that we need this government action, as there is little chance the world will reach net zero by mid-century if the 2/3 of companies that have yet to wake up to the challenge and set net zero targets are not brought along by some form of policy pressure. The good news is that companies that adopt strong practice early will be prepared to prosper in what will be the greatest economic transformation of our time. It is exactly this type of forward thinking that has always set successful business apart from those that get forgotten. Except, on climate change, we can't leave anyone behind. It is critical that net zero companies like yours use your voice and your leverage to help facilitate the development of progressive net zero policy, so that your voluntary ambition can lead to a global transition. Thank you for joining me today for this update on the state of net zero, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your event.